Shut up, compressor. Hey everyone, Matt here with Doogs Models, and welcome to the next installment in the Black Basing 201 video series. This time out, we're going to be demonstrating how to tackle putting dark colors over black primer. Now, this is one thing that a lot of people have expressed concern about over time. The contrast. Hold on. Sorry, bugs everywhere. Austin, March, April now. Anyway, a lot of people expressed difficulty doing the standard, essentially, black basing process with dark colors because the contrast gap is like that. Let's pull out my awesome drawing from the light installment. Where there's black over here and there's white over here, and you've got this whole gap to cross. Now, if we're talking dark colors, we're talking right over here, right by black, so there's this very, very narrow gap to play with. And getting good contrast in that gap can be a challenge, for sure. If you try to take something like, where the hell did it go? This Soviet AMT-12 gray, it's a very dark gray. If you try to take this and just straight up black base it, you can, but there's just not that much contrast variability to play with to build up that micro contrast. So, if you can do a lot with light grays and whites and light greens and things like that, there's less you can really do with this in order to get that contrast going, is the way it is. But that's not to say you can't get tonal variation going by layering additional colors in underneath it. So even if the contrast isn't quite as pronounced as it would be with lighter colors and what you can get with them, you can still get a lot of depth and character out of darker paints. So we're going to be demonstrating that with two colors that have basically been nominated by popular demand. I was already considering them anyway, but several comments have brought them to the fore, so what the fuck. First up, Gloss Sea Blue. This is a challenging color at the best of times. It's, deep, rich blue with some green tones in it. And it's one of those things that outside of the Corsair and a few other aircraft from the, tricolor camo era of World War II, didn't really fade. So there's not a lot of lightning and things like that you can do with it without making it look like complete shit. But there are things you can do to mess around with it tonally that capture, sort of the way that it did wear down and the way that it had various environmental things affecting it. So even if it was always dark, especially once it went to the overall glossy blue and didn't really suffer from sun fade, it still got shit on it. They still had to fly off carriers. It still got dirty over time. So there are ways to reflect that somewhat in what you do before you put on the final blend coat, and we'll be playing around with that. The other one is US Helo Drab. So this is the color that the Army puts on helicopters. It's a very dark, kind of soulless color, honestly. If you have ever seen a completely clean, I'm not sure they actually exist, but a completely clean Black Hawk, for example, they can be pretty boring looking. But the thing with US Helo Drab is it does fade, it does wear down, and if you've seen pictures of, Apaches that have come back from the Middle East, for example, it's hard to tell that they were ever one color. They are faded, they are touched up, there is all kinds of craziness going on in the paintwork that honestly, to me, is the fun of modeling to a large degree. I mean, I love trying to replicate that kind of thing. I've actually got an Apache sitting kind of on standby in the drawer here. I got it started, and then that 45-day group build silliness kicked off. But I do intend to come back to it. And so this is, if nothing else, a trial run for me for that. But a lot of other people have been asking about Helo Drab, too. And these are two, well-known, troublesome-ish colors to do fun things with on an aircraft. So we're going to be tackling these and showing two essentially different ways of tackling a dark color. One, with the glossy blue, of how do you keep it dark, and still do something interesting with it. And with the Hilo Drab, how do you reflect a dark color that has been through the ringer and seen fading and touch-ups and color shifts and all kinds of things like that? So two rather different approaches, two different colors, both dark, both over black. Let's get to it. Okay, so it's time to get started on the glossy blue side of things. And instead of doing something like putting a light blue down on here, which wouldn't really be the right thing to do because of the way this stuff generally does not fade. But also, if you put a lighter blue or lighter, cooler colors in general under this stuff, what happens is it tends to oversaturate like nobody's business and becomes this really gaudy, vibrant blue that nobody wants. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to go with warmer tones that are the opposite of that sort of cool end of the spectrum, and we're going to put dark, warm tones underneath, starting with this wonderful Mr. Paint Eggplant Dark Gray. This is that sweet color that the Hell Ducks wear nowadays, and it is a great color to put underneath the glossy blue because it can help modulate it without driving the saturation through the roof, and actually helps hold the saturation in check a little bit. One thing I've found with the glossy blue is trying to make it too defined causes problems. So if you have this more fuzzy approach, it tends to work a little better. All right, I'm going to leave that inside portion there for a different shade, and we're going to switch out. Okay, next up for our color adventure, we're going to be doing the AMT-12 Dark Gray. This is one of the darker grays that I have in MRP land. Another one I like to use is Engine Gray from Guns. They're pretty similar tonally. As you can see, it's slightly different tonally from the Eggplant. Okay, next up we've got something that might be a little bit surprising. NATO black. Now you might think NATO black is black, but it's not exactly. You know, so if you look up here, it's mostly black, but it's a little bit different in tone than the primer. And so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to come in and give it sort of a blend coat of this to just dirty things up a little bit and call it a day. And I've also got a little bit of work, as you can see here, going on with the Hilo Drab side. I've put the AMT Gray down just for kicks. So I'm going to come in here and put a little bit of NATO black in here as well. Okay, so that's it for NATO black. As you can see, we're barely using colors here. I mean, it's in and out. Very, very light touch. Okay, so next up, we're going to start to get a little bit freaky with the colors here. We're going to go with this Mr. Paint Chestnut Brown. It's a nice, muddy brown, not as red shifted as a lot of browns out there. It's definitely a little bit on the cooler side, or on the grayer side. But we're going for desaturation here. So we don't want to use too much of it, just enough to get the hint in there. Just like all these colors, really. And this color also plays on the Hilo drab side, so let's do a little bit of that. Okay, I'm going to call that good for the Hilo drab side. Let's go back here. I've got one more color to add. It's going to take me a second to mix it up, so hold on. Okay, so the next color in our fellowship is Guns C29 Whole Red. Now, at first, Whole Red seems like a really weird color to put under something like Gloss Sea Blue, right? Well, yes, it does, but it has a interesting property with these heavy red tones in that it desaturates blue. Now, if you've ever, just to talk about the inverse briefly, if you've ever used like a gray-brown wash, like a panel line wash or something on top of blue, you may have noted that instead of having this nice deep gray-brown color, the blue leaches all of the stuff out and basically leaves behind the red shit brown looking color. It's awful. And the same kind of works on the inverse, whereas if you put that red brown color underneath the blue, it'll leach out some of the saturation of the blue and leave you more of like a subdued gray blue instead, which is pretty cool. This has been thinned pretty heavily, so it's going to go down very subtle like. Over here, where I can play off the brown tones and the walnut brown. Now let's bust out the Gloss Sea Blue and put it down on top of this and see what we get. Okay, so we've got a bit of Gloss Sea Blue here for the blend coat. I've added a few drops of Mr. Leveling Thinner to soften that linear build. As you can see here, it's very thin at this point. It looks like that chocolate brown might be a bit too much of a standout here. Yeah, it definitely is. Wow. Might need to rethink this a bit. Yeah, that is crazy. Interesting. Who would have thought the chocolate brown, or the walnut brown, is the thing that's fucking all this up? You can see the, you can see how much lighter it is compared to over here where we've got the whole red and the eggplant and the NATO black and stuff. And that is a substantial difference. That's the thing with Gloss Sea Blue, though, is lighter colors underneath really bring out the tones in it, and you don't really want that. And so it's a matter of how do you get those tones without getting that lightness and that's, you know, that sort of aqua look that it gets. Yeah, because that's not working for me at all. Whereas out here, we're doing great. Building up a nice tonal complexity. You can see right in here how the, I don't know if you can see it or not. This, again, trying to show you this on a monitor that's obviously not translating very well, and I can't tell if the camera's capturing it or not either. But you've got a nice desaturation going on over here, and it looks just like it should. And then over here, it's just, yeah, super, super janky. Well, I think we've got it blending okay. Good enough to show the differences at least. You know what? I'm happy with that. That works. It's not perfect, but it shows off the different things. Sweet. Okay, now that we've got that taken care of, I'm going to go over here and add some glossy blue to the Hilo drab side as well.
not bad. Okay, I'm gonna pause here. Okay, so here is the gloss sea blue. Just hard to see with this camera, but it's nicely uniform, but at the same time not. It's got, I can see from here, it's got different tonal varieties or different tonal variations kind of baked in throughout. Especially over here, this part is slightly lighter and more saturated compared to the desaturated whole red section over here. And, while you want gloss sea blue to overall look the same, shut up, compressor. You also want some subtle depth and variation in there, and this captures that very well. So, with that, I'm going to clean out the airbrush, and we're going to move on to Helo Drab. So my original intention was to do both Gloss Sea Blue and Helo Drab in the same video, but given the amount of work that has to go into the marble coats of both, I think it might make more sense to split this up into 2 videos. So if this cuts off and there's another one, that's what happened. Anyway, the Gloss Sea Blue got knocked out tonight, and this is one of those colors that is a tricky one to get right, especially if you look at the way that aircraft that wore it actually wore. You see plenty of chipping, you see plenty of crud on the surface, oil, dust, footprints, powder stains, hydraulic fluid, all that kind of stuff, all over the place. And as they get more and more worn down, once we're talking about the overall Gloss Sea Blue finish here, once they were out in the elements and everything, the way they weathered was they tended to just go from gloss to more of like a satin, and there's not that much fading you can play with, and a lot of the stuff that comes into really bringing the finish to life comes after paint. It's we're talking oils and weathering and whatnot to really bring out those environmental effects that were attaching themselves to the outside of the paint. But that's not to say you can't have fun with it and do some interesting things to bake in some variation. Now, the one thing, because fading is not really an option with this paint, unless, the all-time caveat, unless you're going with a World War II tricolor camouflage and specific aircraft wearing that camouflage, like Corsairs, Kingfishers. A lot of aircraft, though, that wore the tricolor didn't really fade out all that much. If you go look up pictures of Dauntlesses or Hellcats, good luck finding one that's aggressively faded the way that you find with Corsairs. Part of that, I'm sure, has to do with the fact that Corsairs were largely operating off of desert island airfields, and Hellcats were largely operating off of carriers. But at the same time, Dauntlesses were flying off both, and I've yet to find a picture of a tricolor Dauntless that is anywhere near as faded and battered and worn in that regard as Corsairs. But whatever. We're talking for these purposes here about a non-fading Gloss Sea Blue. So what you would see on, those not really too faded out Dauntlesses, what you would see on pretty much everything after 1945. And how do you do any sort of modulation to that finish if you can't play with the contrast in terms of, light and dark and fading and staining and whatnot? Well, if you can't play with the contrast, you can play with opacity and you can play with tonality. So that's what we've done. The marble coat for this consisted of several colors. It consisted of, let's see if I can find them all again. So the eggplant dark gray, this is what the Hell Ducks are wearing these days. This AMT-12 German dark gray. Chestnut brown, which I actually would not really totally recommend because this color ended up being way lighter than anything else, and threw honestly the whole blend coat into slight jeopardy there for a while. It finally did pull together, but it was noticeably lightening the Gloss Sea Blue as it went down. And finally, Whole Red. Whole Red is a great desaturator for Gloss Sea Blue, and I highly recommend using this if you want to try to capture that more worn Gloss Sea Blue that's seen some better days. And then, of course, the final blend coat with Mr. Paint. So here's what we ended up with. This actually shows up pretty well. I was worried how it was going to show up shooting, the actual painting, and we'll see. But, here under the light, it shows up, I think, quite well. And you can see it is still pretty uniform. You want gloss sea blue to be relatively uniform. But it still has some depth and it still has some interesting things going on. And you can see, this panel right here is certainly lighter and more saturated than what you've got going on, like on these access hatches over here or on this part of the wing. And that is due to that chestnut brown lightening things up a little bit more than I would have liked. But overall, I'm fairly happy with how this came out. It was definitely a good, lessons learned from when I was building the Dauntless and saw what happened there. So if you're going for a gloss sea blue on something 1945 and later, maybe a 84 Sky Raider or something to that effect, definitely a path to consider is layering in dark, warm tones underneath the gloss sea blue and using that to modulate the tones that you get out of the paint itself. You don't want to shift it too much. That starts getting really dangerous with the way that this paint wore in reality. But you can have a little fun. You can shift it a little bit and build just that extra degree of depth into the finish. So that's that. It's getting pretty late here, and I probably need to turn in. But the Hilo Drab blend coat marble coat is underway, and we will get back to this tomorrow. So until then, rest easy, and I will see you on the flip side.